In the last video, we were in First Chronicles chapter 13. And at the end of that chapter, the Ark of the Covenant ends up in the household of Obed-Edom. And we noted how he was a Gittite. That is, he was from Gath. And he was the first of these Gentile peoples that became associated with the people of God in some way. And the beginning of chapter 14, we immediately find another of these characters, Hyram, the king of Tyre. He sends David materials for his house, for the building of his palace. And so he will continue this theme. And continuing in chapter 14, we're also dealing with the establishment, the continuing of the building of the house of David, first in the literal sense in the palace, and then kind of in the metaphorical sense with the children of David. And then the rest of the chapter is going to be dealing with two major conflicts that David had with the Philistines. And those conflicts mirror chiastically with chapters 18 through 20. But there's actually quite a bit going on in this chapter overall. And strangely enough, beginning with Hiram's name, there's actually quite a bit going on even there. So let's just read this first section and then we'll comment along. So Hyram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also masons and carpenters to build a house for him. And David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that his kingdom was highly exalted for the sake of his people. I'm actually going to take this kind of in reverse order here. So the highly exalted language is interesting, as Lightheart notes in his commentary. The Hebrew term ma'al, has been a key term for us in Chronicles, and it means an act of unfaithfulness or sacrilege. And it is the sin that leads to Saul's fall. He ma'aled a ma'al in 1 Chronicles 10:13. And also to the exile of Judah, whose officials and priests ma'aled a ma'al. That'll be later in 2 Chronicles. David does not commit a ma'al. Instead, because of his faithfulness in seeking Yahweh, his kingdom is highly exalted in the eyes of Gentile rulers like Hiram. And what's pointing out here is that the term here for highly exalted, I'll click on it over here, and I'm sorry, over here, so that it highlights our reverse interlinear. And as you can see here, it's related to the term ma'al. So it creates a pun. And as he concludes, Lightheart, that is, he says, as sacrilege is a leitmotif in the brief account of Saul's reign and for the reigns of other unfaithful kings, so the punning term for exalt recurs throughout the chronicler's account of the reigns of David and Solomon. David says that the temple will be exceedingly magnificent. His contributions to the temple are elevated, and Solomon himself is highly exalted. Other faithful kings are also lifted up. The choice before Israel's kings is between ma'al and this other term here, this pun, between sacrilege and exaltation. Unfaithfulness brings kings down. Faithfulness lifts them up on high. So the point here being, this is basically a pun with our ma'al term that we have come across many times already. Now, here's where we'll get to the bulk of this. And strangely enough, there's actually quite a bit going on with Hiram's name that I think is kind of the key for a lot of this passage. It kind of pulses throughout this chapter in a really subtle way. And so this is going with John Stone here. He says in page 176, the first of the nations of the world to accord David recognition is Israel's immediate neighbor on the northern coast, Tyre. Chronicles' form of the name of the king of Tyre is Haram. The natural way for Chronicles readers to interpret the name would be to understand it as related to the root haram, devoted thing, and thus to understand it to mean the devoted one. Technically, the name is an abbreviation of the name Ahiram. My brother is exalted, or brother of the exalted one, known from Phoenician inscriptions from quite different roots. And Lightheart similarly notes the same thing. Now, here's what's important. Hiram's name, the way it's written in Chronicles, would look like the term haram, which means something that's devoted to God. And as we're going to see here, it has a positive dimension, right? So somebody devoted to God or something to that effect. But very often, things are devoted in a kind of a negative sense. And so that's what we're going to pick up on. So let's transition over here. Some of you may know where this is going, but in chapter 25 of Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm, the chapter is Holy War. And he's dealing a lot with this term, this devoted term, haram. And he says here, let's see, where do we want to pick up? The idea of haram is broader than warfare. Fundamental to the concept is the sanctioning of some person or thing, because it is forbidden, either due to an accursed status or due to Yahweh's exclusive ownership and use. Persons or objects could be consecrated to Yahweh using this verb. And here's a number of references. No other object or person could be substituted for that which was sanctified in this sense. The death sentence for worshiping another god was described with the same verb. Any person guilty of this crime was accursed. The sentence could not be revoked. Yahweh was the exclusive owner of that life or thing. And what is going to establish through the rest of the chapter here, and we're not going to obviously read through it because for a couple of reasons. One, it would take a while, but more importantly to me, so much of Heiser's work is freely available online. So you could just look up Genesis 6, Michael Heiser, Deuteronomy 32, specifically verse 8 and 9. Again, Michael Heiser, cosmic geography, any of these ideas, and you're going to come across his work where he'll spell this out in all the gory details, no pun intended, because what his thesis is here, and it's brilliant. What he's arguing is that this term shows up a lot in context with the conquest of Joshua, with the wars of Joshua. And over this term is used. Well, it's actually not super common. In fact, I had a discussion, if you want to call it that, with a Muslim recently. And it's always funny when Muslims object to the violent nature of the Bible or something like that. And again, it's ironic coming from a Muslim. But he kept bringing up these passages, and I explained to him in the beginning of the discussion, look, there's a context to these wars. And what Heiser is arguing here is that the context really is about giant clan populations. So sometimes they're not even allowed to even fight and battle some people. Some people, God tells them, do not fight them. I've not given them over to you. Some people, God tells them, look, just drive them out of the land. But there are some places where God says to kill everything, to destroy everything, to burn everything. In those places happen to be giant clan population groups. I was telling this Muslim this, but he would just keep copying and pasting and saying, look, they kill everybody here. And I'm saying, yes, it's a giant clan population. He just wasn't following. But this is basically what Heiser is arguing. And he's going to lay this out throughout this chapter in a lot of detail. But what's important for our purposes here is we have to draw this line here of thinking that Genesis 6 deals with the sons of God, daughters of men. And that union is going to produce giants. These giants are going to become associated with certain people groups. Not every person in those people groups was a giant, but that is where some of the giants congregated into these people groups, into these clans. And it's these clans that this harem passage, this devoted to destruction, everything's destroyed, those places happen to be giant clan populations. And this is what Heiser is noting and documenting in a lot of detail. And so this will become very relevant for us in our discussion here in Chronicles. I do want to note this before we move further, though. You have here listing a number of people that were associated, with the Anakim, right? This is Numbers 13 when the spies go out into the land. They see giants and they don't want to go into the land and battle these people because, they're afraid of these giants. So they said that there were Anakim in the land among the Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites. We already came across the Jebusites. Remember, these were the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. So David has already defeated these people in taking Jerusalem. But continuing further down, there's kind of a conclusion statement in Joshua that I think is very relevant for us. And it's chapter 11 specifically, so 21 through 23 verses. He says, and Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. So notice this, that the land now has rest now that the giants have been dispersed from this land. But only in these three places did some of them remain. So Heiser's going to point out this fact that this language here that in these places only some remained, some of the Anakim. And so he's asking why that odd note, and he points out here that these are Philistine cities. One needs only to recall Goliath of Gath and his brothers to understand that the writer of Joshua is setting the stage for the fact that annihilation of these bloodlines would continue into David's era, which brings us to 1 Chronicles 14 specifically now. And I can't help but note the parallel here of the fact that you have Joshua in the Old Testament driving out the Canaanites, dispossessing the giants of the land. And of course, David is kind of doing a bit of a cleanup operation at the very end of all this. In the New Testament, Jesus, whose name is the same as Joshua, is dealing with people that are possessed. It's not the land that's possessed. People are possessed by demons. Jesus is driving out not Canaanites, but demons from the people. And if you follow all of this stuff, the Bible never actually gives a clear explanation for where demons come from. The second simple answer, though, and one that the Bible probably alludes to in certain places, is that demons were the spiritual side of a giant, basically, the spirit of a giant. And so demons, have their origin from the Genesis 6 event in some way. They're second generation watchers, essentially. And so you had Joshua and David defeating giants in the Old Testament. Again, driving them out, dispossessing them. Jesus now is dealing with the spiritual side of that, with demons. Again, the byproduct of these giants. And his dispossessing the people, if you will, driving out from the people demons. And it's a very subtle foreshadowing of what Jesus would do. Of course, Jesus, Joshua, the son of David, right? So all of these themes merge in Jesus. Okay, so let's go back to our text and let's keep all that in mind, right, as an introduction, that Hiram's name would bring to mind this devoted language. And that devoted language takes us back to Genesis 6, to the other fallen gods, basically, and they're mingling with the people groups which produce the giants, which are a thorn in the side to the people of God, right? That's basically our backdrop. And let's go ahead and deal with this first of these battles with the Philistines, starting in verse 8. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went out against them. Now the Philistines had come and made a raid in the valley of Rephaim, and David inquired of God, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up, and I will give them into your hand." And he, that is David, went up to Baal Perazim, and David struck them down there. And David said, "God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a bursting flood." Therefore the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And they left their gods there, and David gave command, and they were burned. And the second conflict, let's just go ahead and read it all the way through. And the Philistines yet again made a raid in the valley. And when David again inquired of God, God said to him, "You shall not go up against them. Go around and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then go out to battle, for God has gone out before you to strike down the enemy or rather the army of the Philistines." And David did as God commanded him, and they struck down the Philistine army from Gibeon to Gezer. And the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. So let's just kind of take this apart piece by piece. Let's begin here with this language of raiding in verse 9. So Johnstone notes in his commentary on page 178, "A strong Israel under David is now in the position to engulf the favored lands of the Philistines on the coastal plain." Accordingly, the Philistines launched 2 successive campaigns, advancing on both occasions on Jerusalem by way of the valley of Rephaim, which runs from the west between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Both times, Chronicles uses the verb PST, the consonants PST, and here it's speaking of the raid, for the assonance with Philistines, as in 1 Chronicles 10:8. No doubt they were hoping to repeat their successful tactics against Saul. And what is referring to assonance is, like, the best example I could think of would be something like the well-known Peter Piper picked a whatever, Sally sells, she sells. That it doesn't rhyme exactly. It's not a pun. It's just you have a lot of the same sounding letters or words, same sounding sounds in a series of words. And so raid and Philistine do that in Hebrew. And so you often find raiding and Philistines kind of in conjunction, and that's what it's noting there. Concerning this term, Myers notes in his Chronicles commentary on page 105 that 2 Samuel 5:18 has spread themselves out. The verb here could be influenced by the Aramaic meaning to stretch out, spread out, though it is doubtless better to retain the Hebrew meaning plundering, making a raid, and compare that with the Akkadian pasatu, which means to destroy or wipe out. And picking up here with the Valley of Raphaim, I don't think I'm going to read Myers' quote here. You can pause and take your screenshots if you want to read it. Selman, in his commentary, says whether the second battle occurred at the same place and time is much less clear. And this is a part of a broader comment he was making, and he was talking about the chronology of a lot of these events, which notoriously, I mean, it's ironic we're in the book of Chronicles, but the chronology is very all over the place, right? You can't just read it strictly chronologically speaking. And so he was dealing with a lot of that stuff, but we'll pick up. He says the place name is omitted in verse 13, and Gibeon is mentioned in verse 16. Many commentators have concluded that the second conflict was an attempt to recapture the city from David and took place in the Gibeon area northwest of Jerusalem. On the other hand, Raphaim appears in 2 Samuel 5:22, which is the parallel to this, and is perhaps assumed in verse 13 here, so the LXX, suggesting a similar location to the first battle. However, the extensive pursuit towards Gezer on the edge of the coastal plain is a hint that the fighting covered a much wider area than any single battlefield. Now, that's all well and good and quite dry information, but here's what they're getting at, and this is important. So we have in verse, I think, 9 and verse 13. So here, this is the LXX. The Philistines came and met together in the Valley of the Giants. I mean, that explicitly links us back with Genesis 6 type stuff. And again, they have in verse 13, they assume the valley is the same. They say the Philistines added yet more, and they met together yet again in the Valley of the Giants. And so that's where they do battle. That's where David fights them and defeats them, is in the Valley of the Giants. And of course, Raphaim were associated with giants as well, giant clan population. So that makes perfect sense. And frankly, technically, the Raphaim a more technical idea is they're kind of like the warrior kings of old, right? That's kind of the way you see them. You see them in Sheol with, like in Isaiah 14, all of that stuff. So anyway, some of that will become relevant again here in a moment. But commenting on the language here, where David inquires of God whether he should go up, Lightheart mentions on page 50, prayer is the key to David's victories. He asks and seeks Yahweh before each battle. In this, the chronicler continues his habit of setting David and Saul in contrast. Each time he uses the verb Shaul, the basis for the name Saul, David proves a better Saul than Saul. Saul was the asked-for king who did not ask God or seek him, while David is the king who asks God for help. And here we have a note picking up with Lightheart about the broken through language. We noted this in the last video, that this language, where is it at? Verse 11? If I click on this here, you have this Perez base lemma, whatever. It shows up here and it shows up in the people names, but it also showed up back in chapter 13. So remember, David bursts out. He breaks forth with a plan to move the ark. And he was ill-advised, and so when when Uzzah reached out to grab hold of the ark, the Lord breaks out against Uzzah, and the place is called Perez Uzzah. The Lord breaking out against Uzzah. And here, though, now that David inquires of God, now God is going to break through David's enemies because he's inquired now of God. So Lightheart, noting on this, says, David learns his lesson. If he wants the Lord to burst out against the enemies and not his servants of the Lord, he needs to seek the Lord according to his ordinance. In the end, he proves to be a true son of Perez, Judah's son who broke through to become preeminent over his brother Zerah. And continuing further down, now dealing with the second battle and conflict here, although it should be noted, I shouldn't pass over this. In verse 12, so after the first conflict, they say that, and that is the Philistines, left their gods there, and David gave command, and they were burned. Now, that's not, there's nothing technical in here with the ban language, the haram type stuff. However, that is part of what they did. They were not supposed to take spoils from the war, and so they were supposed to burn everything and send it up to God, basically. And they do that here. They don't take the idols; they actually burn them. So that actually follows along with some of this ban language that takes us back to the conquest in Joshua. Let's move further down. I think we're going to pick up here in John Stone's commentary. His commenting on this second conflict now. This time the guidance is the opposite. The go up of verse 10 is countered by you shall not go up in verse 14, followed by a tactical withdrawal and a feint to a clump of balsam trees. A sound of marching on the tops of the trees will then be the sign for the attack, for it will be the sound of the sallying forth of the cosmic powers mustered by the Lord of hosts himself, determining the outcome of the battle. Led by such a force, David sweeps the Philistines out of the hill country and the lowlands from Gibeon, that was the hometown of the powerless Saul, all the way to Gezer. And commenting on this language here, Japhet also notes that God's answer contains what may be interpreted as a strongly anthropomorphical element. The sound of marching is a sign that God has gone out before you to smite the Philistines. But the question remains, what is this sound of marching? And does it allude to some mythological context already lost? Now, again, I think John Stone's commentary here obviously picks up on and answers that's how he sees it. He sees it as this is the cosmic powers of the Lord personally doing battle with the people first before David goes out. You actually get this in Joshua. You actually get this in Judges as well, where God actually directly intervenes in some of the battles. Now, in some of those, you actually have a little bit more information as far as there was a great hailstone and things like that, and that actually kills many of the enemy combatants before the people even get there. We don't have any of those details, but I do think we're supposed to see this as a holy war, as part of a divine conflict. And it's not surprising, again, given the fact that we began this chapter. This takes us to the end of the chapter. But the beginning of this chapter, you have a willing person devoted to God, that is Hyram. But again, his name brings to mind this concept of being devoted over to God. You're either going to do so willingly, like Hyram did, or in battle, in defeat. And that's how you end this section with another of these divine conflicts.